Next, we will have Dr. Roon Saeed, who will be discussing the topic, identity and mental health, addressing the psychological impact of identity struggles. Dr. Roon Saeed is a trained professional in psychotherapy. She received her PhD in family social science at the University of Minnesota and is currently pursuing Islamic knowledge as a student through Jannah Institute and Ribat Academic Institute. Dr. Roon's work blends Islamic practices and psychology into a holistic, strengths-based approach. Join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Roon Saeed.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Allahumma salli wa sallim ala nabiyyina wa habibina Muhammad. So my topic today is to talk about identity and mental health. And before I get started, I want to sort of clarify that when I'm talking about mental health, I'm not talking about sort of that clinical diagnosis of mental health, but the stressors that come from our day-to-day life that can impact our mental health and our mental well-being, inshallah. So I wanted to start off with talking about how do our identity struggles impact our mental health. So for my thesis, what I decided to research was how do Somali American youth balance their identities? What does that look like? So I interviewed about 15 Somali American young adults, asking them, how does it feel to be Somali? How does it feel to be Black? How does it feel to be American? And how does it feel to be Muslim, especially when you're living in a predominantly white state like Minnesota? And something interesting that came up was a lot of them shared that their identities sort of rejected them. Even though they were born here, even though they're Somali, even though they're Muslim, they faced backlash from their communities. Something, for example, being American and living in a very white nation, they were told, you're not American enough. You don't fit the definition of what it means to be American. And then when it came to their Somali identity, even though both of their parents are Somali, they're being told, you're not Somali. Somali matihid. وحتى هاي عيال مريكان, you're say wallahi. There's this distancing that happens. So even though they want to claim that Somali identity, even though they want to speak the language, even when they attempt to speak the language, they're being told, you're not speaking it well enough, you have an accent. So there's this rejection that happens. And when it comes to their Muslim identity, they're being told, oh, did you convert to the religion? When did you become Muslim? So they're actively being rejected from all of their identities. And what that leads to is this lack of belonging. You don't know who or where you belong to. So even though you have these identities, you're being told you're not one of us. And as humans, you do need that belonging. You need a place to call your own, you need that community. But when all of your communities are actively rejecting you, where do you go? Something else that came up in this research study was that a lot of the youth felt like their parents didn't understand. They were like, oh, you were born in America, you should fit in. You're just like the other Americans, without understanding the racism of this country, the rejection of this country. So they're left navigating it on their own. They're left to figuring it out on their own. They're left in these school systems that are like they're marginalizing them, and they're not allowing them to get the benefit of what they need. But to the parents, it's like you're in this country with all of these opportunities, not understanding the barriers that their children are facing. And then being in Muslim spaces where you're told you're not one of us is another form of that act of rejection. So basically, throughout our lives, we're constantly being told who we are. There's this definition of what it means to hold a certain identity, and if the people of the majority of that identity feel like you don't belong, then you're being told you don't belong. So it's up to us to have that ownership of our own identities. There's these narratives that are called a master narrative and an alternative narrative. So the master narrative is a narrative that is defined by the majority of a certain group. So for example, the Somali culture. The Somalis born in Somalia or who are back home sort of define what it means to be Somali. If you're someone that is Somali, that was born or raised in the West, then you're automatically not classified as Somali, or you're not Somali enough. You don't have what it takes to be fully Somali, like maybe your parents are. And then here in America, being American is defined as being white, having blonde hair, blue eyes. So automatically you may have experienced people saying, oh, you speak English so good, or how long have you lived here, or where did you really come? Where did you really come from? So you're automatically being disqualified as being American because of how you look and how you dress. And then the alternative narrative comes from those who say, you know what, you have your definition and I have my own. So you're reclaiming that identity and you're redefining. And I see a lot of our Somali youth doing this actively. They're seeking out their culture, they're seeking out their language, even when they're being told, oh, عيال Maraykan baad tahay, adu waxaa ma garanaysid, you don't know the language, you don't know the culture. They're actively rejecting that, and they're reconnecting with their Somali identity. They're reclaiming their American identity. And most importantly, they're relearning their Muslim identity. For a lot of people who have been in the Duksi systems, they didn't have that Islamic foundation of knowing who their Lord is. So to just learn the Quran or to just be in a Duksi, you're really lacking the foundation of your Islamic identity if you don't know who you're worshiping. Yes, you're reading the you're reading the words of your Lord, but who is your Lord? Who are you worshiping? Who is the one that is telling you to do this? When we don't center Allah within that Muslim identity, then again, that narrative piece comes into play, and we're taking that information from other people. I need to learn the Quran because these are the words of my Lord. Who is my Lord? Who am I worshiping? Allah is Ar-Rahman. Allah is Ar-Rahim, Allah is Ar-Razaq. When we learn His attributes, that strengthens our Muslim identity, because we don't need someone to identify us as being Muslim. We don't need someone to define us as being Muslim. We're reclaiming that for ourselves. And I think that's what's very important when it comes to the Muslim identity. So when you're struggling with your identity, when you're struggling to define who you are, and the people that you're around are really not accepting you, you're not really feeling that belonging, what that does is it impacts your mental well-being. It impacts your mental health, because you're in this constant pursuit to belong to something, to belong to someone, and when you're actively getting rejected, that causes harm to you. So what you might notice is that, you have this lack of belonging, you feel alone. And interestingly, loneliness has now been classified as one of the primary concerns of mental health when it comes to the population. A lot of people are experiencing loneliness, and it may have emerged, earlier when COVID-19 happened and we had to all sort of isolate, but the impacts of it are being felt throughout. So that sense of community is important to our well-being. We need our people. When we hear about the stories of our parents when they were back home, it was a village. They had all of these supports in place, and those are the supports that we need and that we're actively trying to build. So you can notice things like your sleep is not that great, you're more irritable, you're more anxious, your mood is lower, because you're navigating all of these systems and you're navigating all of these areas that you're sort of facing rejection. You're trying to force your way into these spaces that are telling you that you don't belong. So I hope that part sort of clarifies how that lack of belonging, that confusion around identity, trying to figure out who you are, shows the impacts that it can have on your mental well-being and your mental health. And again, that isolation that also happens when you're navigating it by yourself, because maybe the people in your life don't understand. To them, you're in this space already, that means you're accepted. Whereas for those who are in college or in high school, you're in spaces that are actively rejecting you throughout. So throughout all of our identities, the core of our identity, we might be Black, we might be American, we might be Somali, we might be Palestinian, we might be Syrian. You have these identities, but at the core, and what brings us here together, is that Muslim identity. That Muslim identity is the one that needs to be centered and needs to be strengthened. And something that you might realize is that when your spiritual health, when your iman is low, you also have those symptoms of low mental health, that your emotional well-being and your mental health is not that great. And this is not to say, because I hear this a lot in the work that I do, that people are being told, oh, because you're not a good enough Muslim, that's why you're struggling with depression or anxiety. That's not what I'm speaking to. What I'm speaking to is that when we're not connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we feel that our spiritual health is declining, and we have those impacts of like feeling depressed, feeling anxious, feeling irritable, feeling frustrated, because we're not living true to our purpose and what we were created for. So when I say that, when your iman is low and you notice that your spiritual health is declining, you'll notice these other symptoms of emotional distress. This is not to say, again, that the level of your faith indicates that you'll get like a mental health diagnosis. What it means is that the level of our faith can impact our emotional well-being. So when we think about strategies, what can I do? So the focus, again, is on that Muslim identity, centering it and strengthening it. The first thing is to live a life that centers Allah. When you think about your life and the day-to-day of it, where does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fit into it? Think about your prayers. Is your day built around your prayers, or are you sort of forcing the prayers into your day? When you live a life that centers Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it changes how you move about your day. It changes the decisions that you make because Allah is at the forefront. You're thinking, okay, when I do this thing, how is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala going to feel about it? How is this going to impact me? We know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the all-hearing, the all-knowing, the all-seeing. So we can't hide from Him. So living a life that is mindful of Him allows you to make decisions that are pleasing to Him. What does your schedule look like? Think about your day-to-day. How often are you in remembrance of Allah? Do you start your day with the remembrance of Allah? Allah has built it into our day. We wake up. For some of us, we're praying our tahajjud prayers. We do fajr. We do our dhikr. Doing your morning adhkar. You're starting out the day feeling strengthened by being in the worship of Allah. You have that protection from the adhkar that you read to help you as you navigate your day. But if we're waking up, barely getting to fajr, maybe skipping fajr, but we feel that we have to make that morning meeting because it's so important, well, what about that meeting that you had with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Why wasn't that important? Why wasn't that at the forefront? And a lot of the times we're thinking that because I have to make this meeting so I can get this promotion, we think that, getting that promotion relies on us, that because of the actions that we make, we're going to get this, when in reality, our success is only through Allah. We're putting forth this effort, but the outcome lies on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But in the beginning, we're making dua, Ya Rab, please grant me this opportunity. We're doing the actions. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because of His infinite mercy, He grants it to us. And then who takes the credit? You're like, I worked so hard. I got that promotion. I put in the time. I put in the hours. No, that success is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's because of Him that we got it. So remembering that. So again, living a life that centers Allah. Making a schedule that, puts in that remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Think about, who are you surrounding yourself with? For those of us who work in corporate America, there are a lot of atheists in those spaces. There's a lot of people that will make fun of religion, will make fun of those who are religious, will make fun of God. And when you're in those spaces, at first it impacts you, and you're like, this is wrong, but after a while you become desensitized, and you're sitting in those conversations. Maybe you're not engaging in them, but it's not bothering you that you're leaving that space. So think about, who am I surrounding myself with? Am I in circles of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Am I in places that, increase my iman, that increase my love of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that connect me to my pious predecessors? Or am I in spaces that are just dunya focused, that chip away at my well-being? So really reflect on who you're surrounding yourself with and what are you spending your time with. And when you live a life that centers Allah, that you live a life that aligns with your true purpose, remember, what are we created for? to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when you live that life, you feel liberated because you're living a life that aligns with your fitrah for what you're designed to do. You're designed to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That was the purpose of your creation. And when you have that, you have clarity on who you're supposed to be and what you're supposed to do. And you feel liberated because all of these outside noise, the environment that we live in, the people that are telling us this is how we're supposed to be, that doesn't matter. What matters is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells me how I'm supposed to be and how am I supposed to live in this life. It's not saying that you're not going to be a part of this life, that you're not going to go to college, you're not going to get a job, but you can do it in a way that is pleasing to Him and that you don't lose sight of what you were created to be here for. And then living in this way also doesn't give you, it doesn't take away the difficulties of this life. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that this life is full of tests and trials, right? In Surah Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in verse 155 to 157, we will certainly test you with a touch of fear and famine and loss of property, life and crops. Give good news to those who patiently endure, who say when struck by a disaster, surely to Allah we belong, and to Him we will all return. They are the ones who will receive Allah's blessings and mercy, and it is they who are rightly guided. So we're already being told we're going to endure these tests. It's a part of our life. And when we live a life that is centering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we're in our true purpose, we're going to understand that these things are going to happen. We're going to face these difficulties. But our perspective is going to be different. We're not going to say, oh, we're being tested with something bad. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't ever do anything bad. That's us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always giving us blessings. He's always merciful. Sometimes when we think about those attributes, we think about it in a way that it stops because we don't understand it. We don't understand that this test that we're going through is actually a blessing from Him. It's a mercy from Him. It's a protection from Him because His attributes are everlasting. They don't stop. So shifting from that perspective of this difficulty is bad or it's bitter, but looking at it as this is an invitation to His presence. Allah is inviting me to seek Him out. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is noticing that I'm getting distant. He's bringing me back closer to Him. He wants me to reconnect with Him. So looking at it as an invitation from your Lord who misses you, and this is the only way that you're coming back, is through this test or through this trial. So from this lecture, my time has been up, but I just wanted to make sure that I shared those points, but I hope that you see that when you're seeking direction on what your identity is supposed to be from others, it causes you this emotional distress, this mental distress. But when you're going back to the source, from the one who created you, and you're strengthening that Muslim identity in a way that centers Him, then what that does is it liberates you from all of those definitions and all those labels that you're trying to fit, and it provides you with that framework for how you're supposed to navigate this life. This doesn't mean disregard your other identities. Those are a part of who you are, also given to you by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What we don't want is for those other identities to take precedence over the one that's going to matter in the hereafter, inshallah. I pray that you benefit from what I shared. Anything good that I've said is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and may you forgive me for any mistakes that I've made. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.